Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Very good. Good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books. Not books with lunch, not lunch and books, but lunch with books. Thank you. Please turn off your cell phones at this time as a courtesy to our guests and our other attendees. Next week, we will have predatory birds in here, also known as raptors, and a young man who handles them working for Laurel Fork Falconry. So I think he said he's bringing 3, and I'm hoping that one of them is an eagle, because they have an eagle, bald eagle, but we'll see. So that's next week, Laurel Fork Falconry. Simmer down, please, simmer down. Thank you. And in 2 weeks, on the 23rd, we will have Enzo Chiodo. He plays the banjo, but he plays all kinds of genres, and he will showcase the versatility of the banjo. And he has a trio that he plays. Today, our guest is Hank Lutton. He's a registered professional archaeologist with 25 years experience in field excavations, research, and collections management. He received a BA from George Washington University, which focused on political science, foreign affairs, and history. Hank received an MA in historical archaeology from the College of William and Mary and was a presidential teaching fellow at the archaeology department at Boston University. He was an archaeologist for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation and directed major urban excavations in Yorktown, Hampton, and Williamsburg, Virginia, where he investigated colonial town formation and development. Since 2016, Hank has been a curator at the Grave Creek Mound Archaeological Complex in Moundsville. In addition to preserving and interpreting Grave Creek Mound, he also curates West Virginia's archaeological collection. Here is Hank Lutton.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? How's the sound in the back? Okay. Well, thank you all. Sean, thank you for that generous introduction. And I want to thank the Ohio County Public Library in this program for their invitation to join you today. But most of all, I want to thank you folks in the audience for braving searing heat and beastly humidity when you could have stayed at home and live streamed this. But being in the basement and the air conditioning working rather well, I think we probably have the best spot. So thank you for coming. The purpose of this presentation is to try to rectify something I did. Several years ago, I gave a presentation on a similar topic, but afterwards I felt as though I had emphasized too greatly the absence, the loss of indigenous earthworks. And I didn't want to feed into that narrative that there's nothing left or it's all gone. So with this presentation, I really want to try to emphasize the persistence and the endurance of prehistoric mounds and earthworks in the Upper Ohio Valley. And in many cases, they're hiding in plain sight. Before I begin, I'd like to make a disclaimer. This presentation contains images of indigenous burial mounds and earthworks. Some images depict these sacred indigenous structures in various states of neglect, destruction, and sacrilege. Some of you may find the images offensive, and that's perfectly an appropriate response. Most of these images are early on in the first 5 or 10 minutes. If you're troubled by something, please feel free to step out and pop back in after a couple minutes. There's nothing too gruesome. There are no human remains, and I tried to use photos that didn't show just complete abandoned like treatment of the earthworks and mounds. Now, in the late 18th century, as Anglo-American colonists crossed the Appalachian Mountains, they descended into the watersheds of the Ohio and the Mississippi River valleys, and they were stunned by what they found. And that was tens of thousands of indigenous mounds, burial mounds, platform mounds, earthworks, and they found them in intense concentrations that totally surprised them. Now, we'll never know how many earthworks were constructed by Native Americans. This map, which was constructed at the end of the 19th century, although it's not comprehensive, what it shows is that there are visible concentrations. You can clearly see things like the upper Midwest, the Mississippi River Valley, the Ohio, the Kanawha, right here, and then to the north of that, where we are located, there are significant concentrations. One estimate is that there may have been as many as 100,000 mounds and mound groups throughout North America. They were often constructed on terraces and ridgetops overlooking waterways. These were not mere piles of heaped soil. They were built very carefully with intentional layering of different types of material, like clay, sand, gravel, sometimes stone, so that the mounds would withstand erosion. The fact that some of these have existed for 2,000 or more years indicates the intentional construction and the long-term nature that was intended. Now, there are various types of mounds. There's the one that we see most common in this area, which is the conical mound, typically used for burials. There are platform mounds, which are level on top so that structures can be built, houses, temples, ceremonies conducted upon them. And there are effigy mounds, which are created in the shapes of animals. There are also walls and enclosures surrounding the mounds, and sometimes ditches that are dug, the soil from the ditch then thrown up to create a berm. And many of these monuments are on a colossal scale. Some of these enclosures enclose 50, 100 acres. They are elegantly designed using some form of geometry, and they have alignments, very precise alignments with astronomical events like the summer and the winter solstice. They really are engineering feats. And at the most basic level, they are, at the most simplistic level, they are very beautifully symmetrical. Now, being composed largely of soil, they inherently don't have a durability that comes with masonry architecture, such as the observatory at Palenque in Mexico. So as the colonists began to settle into this area and what was called the Ohio country, agriculture became the first threat to the mounds. Plowing would disrupt the ground cover, churn up layers, disturbing and destroying, in some cases, things like burials and archaeological information. This is a mound, a lower Minch mound, which was located on a ridge overlooking Warwood. And in 1960, it was excavated because the property owner wanted to convert this area into a paddock for horses. You can see that there's a very clear, there we go, very clear curvature on this terrace. The archaeologist who excavated this in 1960 believed that this mound was probably on the order of 5 or 6 feet high, but constant plowing had created erosion and it deflated the mound. That is, it spread the soil out, lowering the height and distorting the actual shape of the mound, so that when it was excavated, there was only 2 feet of soil left. And they had to sort of guess what the footprint of it looked like. So in addition to agriculture and in salvage situations like that, Beach Bottom Mound is a prime example of scientific inquiry. It didn't have to be done, but archaeologists from the University of Pennsylvania in 1930 put a trench across Beach Bottom Mound, and they also quartered a section of it. So the mound still exists. They filled back in the areas that were excavated, but this shows, again, a factor that contributes to the loss of the mounds. And urbanism became one of the primary threats. This is a plat of the city of Marietta, Ohio. It shows the original grid system with the streets and the blocks, but it also shows that superimposed over a complex of prehistoric mounds and enclosures. And you can see there is what's called the Sacra Via, the Sacred Way, which led from the river up to the main complex. There are platform mounds, and this is a conical mound that would look like what we have in Moundsville at Grave Creek. So even though parts of this were destroyed just by the constructing of roads and houses, several of these features survive to this day. So the part of the walls for the Sacred Way, the conical burial mounds, and parts of these platforms actually survive today. I think living here in the Upper Ohio Valley, we forget how quickly urbanization came in some of our communities. This is Newell, West Virginia in 1905. It's been laid out by surveyors. They're ready to start building. This is Newell 5 years later in 1910. So these floodplains that they're constructing on, anything in there is subject to disruption and disturbance. Now, in that vein, I want to briefly turn our attention to St. Louis. This is an early depiction, and most people don't realize that the 19th century moniker for St. Louis was Mound City, because there were hundreds of mounds in and around St. Louis. In the 1840s and 50s, this city underwent massive urbanization and increase in population. Pay attention to this feature, which is a prehistoric mound. And it was called locally, by locals, originally Big Mound. and the mound was sold to a railroad company that carted off the soil to be used for filling in ravines, building berms and embankments for the railroad. And you can see the upper image shows it after the hauling off of soil had begun, and when they were almost done at the bottom. This was basically the size of a football field. It was about 100 yards long and approximately 30 feet high. So in St. Louis, hundreds of mounds have disappeared. In fact, this is the only mound surviving within the municipal boundaries of St. Louis. Sugarloaf Mound in the, I believe, late 20s had this house constructed on top of it. And the owners left, it was abandoned. The last property owners sold this property in 2009 to the Osage Nation. The Osage Nation removed the house, and they are fundraising so that they can buy parcels surrounding it and build an interpretive center to discuss what happened in St. Louis. One of the primary destroyers of mounds in the city was the 1904 World's Fair. In order to create an area large and level enough, at least 16 mounds were raised. And as we all know, living here, the other threat that the mounds faced came from industrialization. This is the Wheeling Pit Plant in Mingo Junction, and it begins to show you what a footprint these mills have. And they're not in isolation. This plant was integrated in certain processes with the Steubenville plant and the Benwood plant. So we're really looking at a very linear footprint. And this is Willow Island Mound in Pleasants County. You can see the power plant behind it. In 1976, the mound was excavated because the plant expanded and came and constructed on this. So, where did mounds begin? It's a little bit undetermined where the earliest and the first ones are, but Watson Brake, which is located in northern Louisiana, is the first mound group, a series of mounds and ridges that form a large enclosure. And so basically it ranges anywhere from about 3 feet to some of the larger mounds are on the order of 25 feet high. And the archaeological evidence is that this was occupied seasonally, particularly in the late summer and early fall. There's no evidence of permanent structures because it was built by hunter-gatherers. And it was occupied for approximately 500 years, between 3,500 and 3,000 BCE. Now this, as well as other sites discovered in places like Turkey, are really turning on its head the notion of civilization and how societies progress. For many years, most of the 20th century, archaeologists believed that you had to have agriculture and sedentary lifestyles in order to begin constructing things like mounds and monuments, or what we like to call monumental architecture. But these nomadic people who move around the landscape with the season in very small numbers had to come together, had to be organized with some kind of apparatus or belief system in order to pool their labor resources to construct this. The best hypothesis that's been put forward is that the occupation and the building of Watson Brake coincides with a period of severe economic fluctuation. Oh, I said economic, I'm sorry, environmental. So there was a period of intense droughts and flooding. And the archaeologists who have excavated there believe that this was a response to that these bands came together, they shared their resources, they may have shared information where to find resources, and this was used in times of trouble, and it may have been used for other things like feasting and ceremonies. And one of the really cool things is these hunter-gatherers who we think might not understand geometry or the moving of the planets in the heavens, they have an alignment built into it so that this gap and the center part on this mound align with the summer solstice and the sunset and then the sunrise of the winter solstice. And as early European explorers came to North America, especially the American Southeast, Spanish conquistadors like Hernan de Soto saw mounds being used by native people. And in fact, there's a well-known story recorded in Spanish documents of De Soto and the priests with him constructing a large cross out of cypress and raising it on top of this platform mound in what is today Arkansas. And incredibly, the mound still exists today, and archaeologists have found a massive post hole with remains of a bald cypress tree in it that looks like it was worked wood. All right, this is something we just got to throw up, and we can go back to if somebody needs to. This is a rough chronological timeline specifically for West Virginia that shows the various periods of indigenous culture and activity in the state. The Paleo-Indian being the oldest. These are the people who were first here, and if we use in Avella Meadowcroft rock shelter, we know this dates anywhere from 16,000 to 19,000 years ago. And being as we're only about 25 miles from there, it's very likely that Ohio County had activity in the Paleolithic, and paleo points have also been found throughout Wheeling and Ohio County. In the archaic phases, people begin to make adjustments to the environment, such as no longer big game hunting, moving to more of a hunter-gatherer, using resources like aquatic resources from the river, birds, in lieu of big game. And the woodland period is what we're going to talk mostly about. And this is a very critical stage where things like ceramics and sedentism begin to emerge. Oh, and I should say, I'm using the Common Era designation. So instead of BC, it's BCE, before the Common Era. And instead of AD, it's CE, the Common Era. The dates remain the same, it's just the label to be religiously neutral. All right, so most of the mounds in this area, we believe, were constructed by the Adena people. And their heartland is this darker area right in here. So it includes the Ohio River drainage for West Virginia. most of central and southern Ohio, going into Indiana and Kentucky. Um, this was the heartland. They had a much broader influence. They traded with people beyond this. Adena artifacts have been found as far away as the Delmarva Peninsula and into the southeast. So the Adena, as I mentioned, were hunter-gatherers, moving around the landscape. They didn't have a permanent village. You know, they would have a summer location, a winter location, places to go when nuts ripened, when animals were plentiful. And they lived in tiny hamlets, maybe only one, two, three at most houses. And they date to the earliest phase of the woodland period. So we're talking roughly 500 BCE down to about 200 CE. So they're really, the Adena are really the first sustained mound building culture. And they built them all up and down the upper Ohio River. So where are they? Is anyone remember Richard Scarry? Cars and trucks and things that go. And there's a little character called Goldbug that appears on each page. And as you're flipping the pages, one of the tasks is to try to identify where's Goldbug. Well, sometimes he's hard to find, but he's always hiding in plain sight. And just FYI, there he is in the old-timey buggy. So they are hiding in plain sight amongst us. Usually they're in places where we don't frequent or they're out of the way. Does anyone recognize this? Yeah. Yeah, okay. Yeah, right. Yeah, there's the stump. Okay. So this is Hodgins Cemetery Mound. It's believed to be a Adena. And what it shows is that the Adena typically constructed the mounds on river bottoms, terraces, and ridges. And they were skillful manipulators of the topography. So the actual mound is like right here, but viewing it from below, there's an optical illusion that makes the mound look larger and higher than it is. This is taken up behind it. You can see it's 12, 13 feet high, not nearly as imposing as seen from this side. And this photo shows that it's located on the very tip of a ridge of higher ground that runs through Tiltonsville. You can see, oops, pardon me. You can see the high ground where the ridge is located, and it's literally on the lip of that ridge and then begins to drop down. This is typical for the conical mounds, whether they're located down on a terrace or they're on top of a ridge. They're almost always situated so that there's one side that's more impressive, and they're really at that tipping point. All right, another mound in the local area. This is privately owned on private property. Grigsby Mound is located above beach bottom. And this is very typical of what most of the conical burial mounds, as far as size and dimension, it's maybe 50 feet across at the base, 5 to 6 feet high. And the gentleman standing on top of it is Father Clifford Lewis of Wheeling Jesuit University, who was so influential in the formation of the West Virginia Archaeological Society and the recording of sites all across the state. And this is what it looks like today, actually last week. And you can see the same phenomenon with manipulating the landscape. It's on the edge of a terrace that rises towards us, and right behind this garage and where the trees start, there's a precipitous drop down to the floodplain where Beach Bottom Mound is located. And you can see the contouring as the ground begins to drop this way, and it's right there on the lip. All right, most of you have probably seen in Glendale Cockaigne Mound. Similar in size to Grigsby, maybe shorter by a foot, and is now preserved under the auspices of the Cockaigne Farmstead, the city of Glendale, and in the Marshall County. And for as long as the Cockaigne family owned it, they were protectors of it, and they wouldn't allow anyone to dig into it. Does anyone recognize this? Hint, it's not around here. So, did someone say something? Oh, okay. This is in Illinois. This is called Monk's Mound. It's located in a complex known as Cahokia, which was the largest pre-Columbian city in north of Mexico City. Archaeologists debate about what the population was. Estimates range from 5,000 up to 40,000 people. This was the largest mound. The base of it encompasses the same amount of space as the Great Pyramid of Giza. And it's called Monk's Mound because for 4 years, French Trappist monks lived on the mound. So as a result of that, there's actually a movement to rename the mound something a little bit more appropriate. But the reason I show this and make the digression is because of the house that's located on top of it in the 19th century and late 18th century. This became a phenomenon. Many people constructed buildings on top of mounds. And this is one of the reasons why some of them have survived, albeit damaged. Okay, so this is a mound in Tiltonsville. Okay. Yeah, okay. It's hard with this photo to see the contours because of the shadows. And I really needed like a wide angle to show how level the ground is on both sides. And then it just rises, it just rises up. So we don't know if this was a small platform mound or if it was a conical mound and they moved the soil to the sides to basically create a platform to build the house on. Right. Yeah. So it follows that configuration. It's right at the edge. On the other side of it, the ground begins to tail off, drop to the river shore. All right. This is located near there in Rayland, Ohio. This is Speedway Mound. And again, we don't know if it was a platform mound or if it was a conical mound that was flattened out. But this angle shows a little bit more of the curvature. And if we go to Moundsville, there's a really good example. This is Price Mound. It's literally located on a knoll. Moundsville is often described as Grave Creek Flats, but the ground surface actually undulates. And there are channels, probably ancient river and drainage channels. And so you get undulations. This is on a natural high spot, and literally the ground drops away in every direction from this house. And then taken below, the problem is the landscaping, which is nice, really sort of obscures the dramatic curvature. All right, so this is an example of a database that the West Virginia SHPO uses. And SHPO is the State Historic Preservation Office. So archaeological sites, historic properties, battlefields, trail systems that are related to heritage, all of this is recorded with the state. When it's recorded with the state, it's entered into this database. So this is the first place people go to try to figure out how many or sites there are and what type of archaeological sites. So according to the SHPO database, the state of West Virginia has or had a total of 424 mounds. That's not a lot. If we look at Wheeling, the municipality of Wheeling and the area immediately adjacent to it only has 32 registered sites associated with it. Of those 32 sites, 18 of them are, 17 of the 18 are mound sites. That seems really odd because people building the mounds have to live somewhere. And generally they lived close to where the mounds are built. So why are there only 18 prehistoric sites when 17 of them are villages? I will say some of these sites, these mound sites, have a village with it or it's on top of a village, but that seems suspiciously low. So to do a comparison, Wheeling comprises 16 square miles. If we look at the city of Alexandria, Virginia, on the Potomac, it's slightly smaller. It has 254 archaeological sites recorded. So there is a fairly dramatic underrepresentation of sites for Ohio County. Why is that? Well, part of the reason is this database didn't always exist. The state only started keeping records circa 1960. So sites that were excavated before that might not be in the system. Sites that were lost that no one recorded aren't in the system either. So with prehistory, we're looking through a veil. Mist and fog are often used for expressions, for a loss of detail or a reduction in clarity. So the search for additional information outside of what's recorded with the state has to find other sources of information: oral history, written documents, visual images, and technology. So written records are very valuable. Historical archaeologists use them all the time. Prehistoric archaeologists are getting better about using them. Now, the issue is that the Adena had no written language. They left no written documents that we can read. So the builders of the mounds, the designers, the people who visited them for religious ceremonies never recorded their experiences in a way that we can directly read them. But documents give us other information. They let us see things, how the site has changed, maybe what was excavated, impressions of it. So I'm going to show several examples from the Upper Ohio River Valley, where documents tell us about a mound that we would not know about otherwise. So anyone recognize this city, Bel Air? This 1882 bird's view shows Union Square, which is a city park located right here. We can see the X formed by walkways. Dan Frizzy, who is an attorney in Bel Air, was doing research on the property ownership of this square. And there was a dispute over who owned it. There was a series of court cases. And in the testimony, he found that in the former mayor of, who was mayor 1870 to 74, he testified that there used to be a mound on the square because the mound was used for all types of local things, but especially circuses that would come to town. And one circus didn't have enough level space and were complaining about the mound being in their way. So he authorized the circus, the clowns maybe, to raise the mound, and anything they found they could keep, according to the mayor. So even though the artifacts are gone, even though we don't really know anything about the size, we know that exists because of this court case. And again, I'll add, it fits that typical location siting for Adena mounds. This is a natural, okay. I'm sorry, bear with me. Did I press something? Okay. Yeah, perfect. So as I was saying, this is a natural rise, and just behind the photographer in the left-hand photo, on the other side of that street, begins to drop off down to the lower terrace in the Ohio River. All right. How many of you have heard that there was a mound located on Wheeling Island? Okay, a couple of you. Why it's only a couple of you is because there's virtually no information on it. This is the most that this quote represents really what we know about the mound. That in 1772, there was a severe flood that crested very soon, retreated almost immediately. It left a boat high and dry, and Mrs. Shepherd, as a young girl, used the boat to hang laundry on. And she remembers that this severe flood was 1772, and the top of the mound was the only thing in sight on Wheeling Island. So we really don't know much about the location of it. The state has an area marked on a map, but doesn't say where that information came from. And Delph Nerona attributed a different location on the island. So where those, what information those are based on are unknown, but probably this area down towards the racetrack is probably where the mound was. And you can see that in 1870, it doesn't show up on the bird's eye view, but oftentimes they didn't. But what we can see is that this area was yet to be developed, other than maybe orchards. And this is a great view sort of that upper area where the mound may have been located. So it's, in order to find some of this stuff, people have to do some in-depth sleuthing using photographs, maybe court records, and of course newspapers. It's ironic that newspapers are disposable and that were always intended to be tossed. Although there was the tendency of my grandfather to construct towering engineering marvels with newspapers. Um, but because it reports on the activities of the day, sometimes they inadvertently capture information that's useful to us as archaeologists. There was also a mound in Elm Grove. Um, it was called Lutton Mound, named after the property owner who had it when it was leveled. There's one or two newspaper accounts that mention it as being 12 to 15 feet in height, 50 feet at the base, with very steep sides and large trees on it. And we don't know what year exactly it was destroyed, probably around circa 1886. So that's when this photograph was taken. Um, so, you know, when you're looking at family albums, um, you know, keep your eye open. There may be a mound in there. And of course, there's Grave Creek Mound. And most of what we know about the early excavation in 1838 was through the publication in the Cincinnati Chronicle, a very detailed description that was submitted by Dr. Thomas Townsend of Wheeling. He was one of the financial backers and an enthusiast for the project. And like the other mounds, at one time, it too had a structure located on top of it. That was originally an observatory, so people could view the river valley and the big oxbow below Moundsville. Some documents suggest that it may have been used as a saloon afterwards. It would seem like a lot of work hauling kegs and liquid, which is heavy, to the top, and would also potentially pose a hazard to people who may have had one or too many cups and started down on a dark night. All right, we know from archaeology that Grave Creek Mound also had a ditch that encircled it. This was a feature common to many of the Adena mounds. This is an example taken from Marietta, from the mound that's surrounded by the cemetery, but you can see, although silted in, the ditch goes around. We know that the one in Moundsville was close to 40 feet wide and 5 to 6 feet deep. All right, and Grave Creek also serves as a wonderful example of other types of documents. Maps. This is probably the most detailed map of the Moundsville area. It was drawn in the mid-19th century, and it would remain so probably into the early 20th. What it shows is the Elizabethtown, which was the original settlement, Moundsville, which was a separate village located directly on the river, and in time they grew together, they unified, and the whole thing became known as Moundsville. So we can see the nascent origins of the towns, the waterways, a little bit of the topography, the narrows, but you can also see there are other mounds in addition to Grave Creek, which is here labeled Large Mound. This is in the late 1840s, 1850. This is after many of the mounds on Grave Creek Flats have been lost. So at this time, there's still visible walls and mounds. So we know from this that there was an entire mound group probably being used as a ceremonial center in Moundsville. And Delph Nerona, who was the curator of the Mound Museum in the old stone building on the south side, did a lot of research on the mound. He mined historical documents for references to it, and he put them together to create the information that's used in this map. what it shows is Grave Creek Mound, and various accounts describe a sacred way, just like Marietta, leading from the river up to the mound, a large octagonal enclosure, walls that run between Grave Creek Mound and the octagon, 3 mounds that are located just to the north of it, and these square enclosures that seem to have been had the same angle, or so the observer thought. So we don't know if all of this was constructed by the Adena, or if the next culture, the Hopewell, added to it. They constructed much of Marietta, and they often had these enclosed passageways at important sites. And if we go back and take a look at this map again, across from the Narrows, you'll see there's at least 3 mounds, an enclosure with a mound in it. And these were almost certainly located in Shadyside, Ohio. And if you're driving by and you see the old casket warehouse factory, that's probably about where this enclosure and the mound were located. And if you look at the topography, it's right on the edge of that terrace overlooking this bend in the river. So after the documents, the letters, newspapers, photographs, the other way to gain additional information is through technology. And because of time, I'm not going to go into each of these. But basically, it's using things like electricity, lasers, magnetic polarization, and sending them in waves through the soil, and different types of soil or soil that's been exposed and packed down will bounce back at different intervals, at different rates, much like radar. So you can track and see below ground disturbances. This is a wonderful case in point. This is near Chillicothe, Ohio. And in the mid-19th century, 2 famous antiquarians, Squire and Davis, recorded this mound group called the Junction Group. So there are a number of enclosures, and there's 1, 2, 3 mounds associated with it. And what's important to remember is this is the profile. So there's below ground disturbance from the ditches. Today, if you go to this field, you cannot see even the faintest rise in the surface of the ground. So archaeologists took some of these geophysical tools that I just mentioned, went out, and like anything else, if you combine multiple tools, you get a little bit of different information. And what they were able to put together, is that below ground, there's still evidence of those ditches, and in one case, one of the mounds. So we have the squarish feature, the 2 mostly enclosed, another square, and below ground, this is what they look like. And you'll notice this configuration is different from this square. So these were eroded, they were worn down, they may have had vegetation on them. Squire and Davis said, oh, it looks like a square. But in fact, it's much more like a clover leaf. So the Heartland Earthworks Conservancy partnered with some other preservation organizations, and they purchased 335 acres around this site to protect it from development. This is basically Chillicothe creeping out to it. And because you can't see them on the surface, they decided they were going to use GPS and plant the location of those features that they saw here on the landscape. So they're planted with a darker crop, and then they're mowed to show the actual size of them. And there's now an interpretive trail that goes around, and people can visit this daylight hours every day of the year, and it's free. And there's an app you can download, and it tells you about what we know about the mound. And you can see just how close the encroachment is from the urbanization. And it was only the organizations that partnered really had to pay top dollar to get it because they were bidding against developers. Okay, so if any of you want to do sleuthing on mounds or sports or whatever your historic interest is, there are some wonderful sources, and you need not go further than this building because the Ohio County Library on their page has digitized newspapers. Another great source is from the Library of Virginia. Many of the papers, but also some different ones. And before the Civil War, we all know it was one state. So what's happening here on the Ohio is being recorded in the Alexandria paper, the Richmond newspapers, and then there's also the Library of Congress. It's called Chronicling America. They have even more newspapers from around the country, and you'd be surprised how many times a story is picked up, and it's kind of like Facebook or the internet. You live here, but you're reading about a story in Florida or Alaska. And so even though that local paper might not survive, maybe the local paper has been lost or not digitized, it's appearing in another one that has. So they're wonderful to search for your own interests. And the signposts of the past, they're all about us. And it's writ in soil, stone, and paper. And we need to realize that the past exists all around us, even when it's not easily discernible, and even if it's where we least expect it. Thank you. Yes, do you have a question? In the Adena Mounds? Okay, so there's a question as to what type of artifacts are found in Adena burial mounds. Usually it can range from nothing to fairly elaborate grave goods like were found at Grave Creek Mound. So there could be beads, either of bone and shell, stone that's been worked into blades and projectile points, weights for atlatls to launch a spear. Generally, if there's a burial involved, there's and it's someone that they wanted to recognize, there'll be a burial vault that can be lined with logs, stone, bark. Sometimes there were mortuary rituals that went on either before or after the body was placed. So sometimes clay is being added and worked to create like benches and almost like basins that were being used for things. Often there's ochre, particularly red and yellow, which could be used for tattoos, decorating clothing. And then there are things like gorgets, which are stones that are worn at the throat. It's a corruption of the French word gorget for throat. Um, Later on, you might get ceramics. One of the burials at Grave Creek Mound had several hundred square pieces of mica, and they were all perforated. They each had 2 holes in them, and they were underneath the individual. So it's believed that this was probably a mantle or a cape of mica. Uh, Probably this wasn't everyday wear and not for everyone. It would be someone of significance, but we also believe hunter gatherers are largely egalitarian. So why does this person, why were they draped in a mantle? So those are the type of things that turn up in Adena burial mounds. Yes. Yeah. For those of you who might not have heard the questions, why in Marietta and other locations are there um, 19th, 18th century cemeteries located around the mound? And I suppose the answer to that, the straightforward, frank answer is it was probably down to the locals as to why they did it. Um, I'm going to venture a speculation here, and that's the 19th century was a time of romanticization. This is a time when people are romanticizing the past. Um, in the late 18th, early 19th century, uh, there are excavations at Pompeii. Ceramics are being made to look like they're Roman and Greek. So I think this is a way that local people in Marietta and Tiltonsville either saw a sacred space and decided to embrace it, or they were looking to bring antiquity and maybe some level of respectability to their new community. I mean, to them, it's new. They didn't know people had been walking here and living here for 19,000 years. But in the 19th century, there's a lot of civic pride, and there's this focus on respectability and we're a proper place. And you see it in architecture of the time when municipalities are spending a lot of money, and often it's, you don't have to have a waterworks that looks like it's a Georgian house, but yet they did it. So I think something has to be said about that innate desire to say, we have a past, we have roots in this place that to us is very new. Yes. Um, the questions about the significance of the river in relation to the presence of mounds concentrated around it. I think it's because the river and waterways serve a lot of different purposes. At the very practical level, this is a way of transportation. So trade, diplomacy, um, visiting family members, the river's the way to go. And if any of you have seen just recently, there have been like a dozen dugout canoes discovered in a lake in Minnesota. And they're remarkably well preserved. And basically, Native Americans for the winter would put rocks in it and sink it so it wouldn't be freezing and thawing and exposed to the harsh elements. And at some point, someone didn't come back for them. So the river is, I think, fundamentally important for the economy, for social interactions, for news, but I also think it may be filling a spiritual role. Um, One of the things, and this is a very generic response, is that indigenous peoples have a belief that there's a heavenly world, the earthly world, and then there's the world beneath us, which is the water. And that's why, like, some of the petroglyphs have the water panther on it, and so they're very interested in the transitioning between those three planes. And water not only represents part of that, but with fog and vapor, it's also transitory and sort of takes on. The Adena used a lot of birds in their iconography on the few tablets that have been found, and birds may have taken bodies and had the birds deflesh them before they were buried. And the birds are one of the few creatures that can transition from the water, from the earthly realm into the heavens. So that's probably not really articulated the way I hear it in my mind, but it definitely, I believe, has a spiritual component to it. Yeah. Okay. Let me go back to the timeline. Okay. Yeah, the early woodland period is sort of a threshold. Um, the Adena begin experimenting with plants, so they're not full-blown agricultural farmers, but they're growing things like sunflowers and goosefoot, and so they're hunting, they're gathering what things they can find opportunistically, but they're probably cultivating very small gardens with things in them, like sunflowers, squash, gourds, pumpkins, um, and so we begin to see the basics where agriculture will emerge. We also see ceramic production. So in the Paleolithic and the Archaic, people are using perishable items, gourds, turtle shells, um, soapstone, sandstone that's being rubbed out to create very heavy bowls that are difficult to transport, difficult to make in large volume capacity. And ceramics is really a revolution because, yeah, a pot can be heavy, especially when it's full of something, but you can pick it up and go. You can put that in the ground and save it. Um, and so ceramics emerge in the early woodland period as well. All right, thank you for coming. Yes. Oh. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah.